Hey guys, Frosty Dives here, back with another book review. And whenever the subject of Stephen King pops up, inevitably, one of the questions that arises when talking about Stephen King is, has he ever written a book that has scared himself? Something that he considers too dark, too scary, too terrifying to publish? Well, the answer to that is, he did. And today, that is the book we are going to read, ladies and gentlemen, the long-awaited review of Stephen King's Pet Semetary. This is first edition Pet Semetary, so it is the original hardcover. I've always loved this cover, the picture of church with what I'm going to guess is, I think this might be Pascal, but the picture of church in the cemetery here. So, Pet Semetary is a novel written by Stephen King, published in 1983 by Doubleday, and clocking in at 374 pages in the original hardcover. And let me just say that next to it, I would have to say that this is my second favorite book by Stephen King. This is, I'm going to say it right off the bat, this is a tremendous read. And most people seem to know the story or familiar with the story of Pet Semetary either from reading the book or watching the movie that came out in the late 80s, which was a pretty faithful and pretty decent adaptation of the movie, of the book. So, Pet Semetary is the story of the Creed family. And the Creed family, Louis Creed, his wife Rachel, his daughter Ellie, and his 2-year-old son Gage, moved to a home in Ludlow, Vermont, Ludlow, Maine. I almost said Ludlow, Vermont. Ludlow, Maine, because Louis Creed is a doctor. And he gets a doctor's position at the university there. Moves his family to Ludlow. They buy this house. They buy this house right on a very busy road. And they find out he meets a very nice neighbor named Judd, who lived in Ludlow his whole life, an 80-some-odd-year-old neighbor. And they find out that behind their home is a pet cemetery because there's a big road that lives in front of their house, that goes in front of their house, and it kills a lot of pets. And so the kids that got together, they put a little pet cemetery in the little path behind the house. But beyond that, beyond the pet cemetery, is the old Micmac burying ground, and that's really where the fun is. And so, as you may or may not know, the Micmac burial ground has a secret power, and that power is to raise the dead. So things that are buried in the Micmac burial ground come back to life. They don't come back right, but they do come back to life. And that is the gist of the story, right? That's the gist of the story, is that over a Thanksgiving break, Louis's family goes on vacation back home to see her parents. They have a cat named Churchill, Winston Churchill. The cat gets in the road. The cat gets wiped out. The cat dies. Judd introduces Louis to the Micmac burying ground. He buries the cat up there. Cat comes back a couple of days later, or the very next day, like the song implies. Cat comes back from the dead, but not quite right in the head. And you know, the story then goes from there. Eventually, there's a tragic accident, and Louis's 2-year-old son, Gage, runs out into the road, gets hit by a truck, and you bet your bottom dollar you know what's going to happen. Up to the Micmac burying ground they go, and the story goes on from there. I don't want to give too much away, although it is fairly well documented. Most people know the story of Pet Semetary. So let's just say that a couple things about Pet Semetary. Pet Semetary is an amazing book. It's one of the most finely written, tightly woven books that Stephen King. I honestly believe this is, next to it, this is like phenomenal writing. This is a book, one of his masterpieces. Partly because I think part of the book is autobiographical. A lot of what happens in Pet Semetary, for those of you who want to know a little bit about the backstory, part of what happens in Pet Semetary, a good chunk of it actually really happened. Stephen King moved his family to a town because he took a teaching position at the University of Maine for a year. And he moved his family from Bangor to a town. I think it was Orano. I can't remember. But he did. He moved his family to a town. And he bought the house on a very busy road. And there was a pet cemetery behind the house. As a matter of fact, when you read the book and they go through the pet cemetery for the first time and you hear about Smucky the cat, that was their actual cat. That actually did get hit in the road and was buried in the pet cemetery. And Owen, the youngest son, Owen, actually did make a break for the road one day. And lucky for Stephen King, he managed to catch him. Unlike Lewis, who did not catch Gage in the book, Stephen King did manage to catch Owen before he ran out into the road. And so that, I think, got a lot of Stephen King's wheels turning and thinking about what he wanted to write. And that's so a good chunk of this book, minus the supernatural parts of it, did happen. And so there's a good amount of realism in this book. This book is more or less sort of a modern-day retelling of one of my favorite horror stories from way back when. It's more of a modern-day retelling of The Monkey's Paw. If any of you have never read The Monkey's Paw, you might want to go and read it, because the story is pretty much very similar in the way that you got the family in the monkey's paw finds a monkey's paw that will grant 3 wishes, and then things happen from there. So here we are. We're talking about, raising things from the dead. And the horror, I think, in this book is phenomenal. And the horror works for a lot of reasons. And it's not so much the horror of what happened, of these things coming back to life. It's more or less the horror leading up to it. A lot of tragic things happened to the family in this book that had nothing to do with the cemetery. And I think, the cemetery that preys on their fears and on their insecurities. The biggest thing is that Rachel, his wife, has a big fear of death and dying because her sister, Zelda, had spinal meningitis, and so Rachel was there when her sister died when she was very young. And that scarred her. And that was very traumatic for her. And she didn't want to talk about death. She didn't like to deal with the death a lot. They didn't talk about death in the family. They didn't want to talk about it. She didn't think her children should be exposed to that kind of stuff. And if Lewis, being a doctor, says it's very natural, death and dying and life and all this stuff. And so that children should be sort of exposed to it. So there's that battle going on between the mom and the dad about, should kids be exposed to death and should kids not be exposed to death. And then, of course, Rachel got very mad at Judd, the neighbor, for bringing the kids to go see the pet cemetery because she didn't think the kids should be exposed to that kind of stuff at such a young age. So there's a lot of those themes going on. And Judd eventually tells Lewis the reason that he brought them to see the pet cemetery. It's one of the most famous lines. It was in the movie. And it was the tagline of the movie, but he said, the reason that I brought your kids up there to see the pet cemetery is because kids need to know at a very young age that sometimes dead is better. Better than what the burying ground brings them back as. As you know, when Gage comes back violent. And Gage goes on a murdering spree. And then he winds up murdering Judd, and then he winds up murdering his own mom, and then, of course, Lewis has to put him down, and that's pretty much how the book ends. What I like about this book is watching Lewis's slow descent into insanity. Lewis, literally, by the end of the book, is insane. What's the clinical definition of insanity? Clinical definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, by the end of the book, Lewis is insane. He buried the cat. The cat came back. Didn't come back right. Didn't learn his lesson. He buried Gage. Gage came back, homicidal, went on a murder spree, still didn't learn his lesson. So what's the last thing that he does? He goes and buries his wife in the pet cemetery. And, of course, the wife comes back. And it is implied that she comes back and murders Lewis. So watching Lewis, a sane man, sort of devolve into this spiral of insanity as the burying ground and the power of the burying ground grips him and just circles the drain until he goes further and further and further down the scale from reality and sanity into just complete and then utter madness. Stephen King does a very good job of letting us watch the slow and methodical destruction of Lewis's sanity and his mind and his emotions and everything as he is just broken down through the whole book. And then, of course, there's the ultimate horror of not so much what happened with the cemetery, but the big horror in this book is what happened to the kid. The loss of a child. That's a big, heavy subject. The loss of a child, the parent losing a child, especially a parent who's losing a child at such a young age, because Gage was only 2 years old. And so that's sort of what tips Lewis over into actually burying a person in the cemetery, is that he cannot deal with the grief of losing his son, of losing his 2-year-old son in a tragic accident, and the guilt that he feels for not being able to save his son. So the guilt and the depression and the horror and the grief drove him to the cemetery, to bury Gage. The book tackles, this is a book about death, and it tackles a lot of heavy subjects. The death of a child, the grief of parents, what do you do with that grief, how that grief affects you, and how it can literally break you down mentally and emotionally and psychologically until you are driven to extremes. In this case, you are driven to exhume the body of your child and bury it in a burying ground in the hopes that the kid's going to come back. So there's a lot of heavy tones in this book, and it is very well written, and the horror is deep, and the horror is real, and you feel so bad for Lewis, but you just watch him as he just circles the drain, and he just goes down and down further and further, and devolves from a rational thinking person who knows how to deal with grief because he's a doctor and he's had to deal with it, to someone who is literally insane by the end of the book. Stephen King didn't want to publish this book. He finished it and he put it away, and he said he didn't want to publish it. And one of the reasons that he didn't want to publish it is because the book, in his opinion, it was too dark and it was too dismal, and that the book basically, the message of the book is that nothing matters and nothing you do can change anything. And Stephen King felt that wasn't what he doesn't believe that, and so he felt that the book was just so dark that no matter what Lewis did, nothing matters, and so anything you do, it doesn't matter at the end. It's all worthless. And because Stephen King didn't believe that, he didn't want to publish it. But he needed an extra book for his contract with Doubleday, and which is why he published it. And here we have just an amazing book. If you have not read Pet Semetary, you should read it. You should just go out and read it. It is one of his best books. The writing is tight. The horror is great. The characters are awesome. The story just starts out slow, but then it begins to pick up its own speed, and then it just barrels to an ending. And yeah, you can pretty much figure out how this book is going to end, but it doesn't matter because the fun is in getting there. And then you get to it, to the end, and you pretty much know how it's going to end. But that's okay, because the ride is well worth it. The horror in this book works on so many levels, the supernatural horror, but just the horror of having to deal with the death of a child in your family, or the horror of how do you if you're a person who is living with a disabled person in your family, like Rachel was living with her sister, and how that affected her for her whole life, and how she wanted to love her sister, but she felt angry at her sister at times, and she felt guilty at times because she wanted her sister to be dead, and that made her feel guilty, but that's how she felt, and all of the things that go with that. There is a lot of heavy baggage in this book. But it is so well written. It is so well done. I can't just say enough good things about Pet Semetary. And I'm quite honestly surprised it took me this long to read it and review it. And one of the reasons I did reread it is because they are going to be making they're going to be remaking this movie. It's going to come out next year. And so hopefully it's good. I think the movie of Pet Semetary was as faithful of an adaptation as a Stephen King movie can be. They did change some things. A little bit of... some liberties were taken, some things were changed, but they didn't affect the overall, you know, the overall translation of the book. So I think the movie is well worth your time to go watch. The book is certainly well worth your time to go watch. And there's just so much in here. It's so well described. The material is very heavy, but it's handled in such a great way. You know, it's hard to write about the death of a 2-year-old, but Stephen King did it in a very tactful way. He did it in a way that wasn't gratuitous, that didn't seem to be cheap or to be, you know, over the top. As a matter of fact, the actual accident with Gage is not really told in description. It's told in sort of like mental flashbacks as Lewis is thinking about it, but you get the gist of what happens, but King never goes into graphic detail about what happens, so there's not graphic violence of a 2-year-old in the book. Your mind can comprehend what happens. He handles it in a very tasteful and tactful way, but still gets the point across of, hey, you know, this is what happened. This 2-year-old got hit by an 18-wheeler. So, and it kind of lets your mind, you know, fill in the blanks that he doesn't want to really fill in. So, I have to say that in the movie, the portrayal of Zelda in the movie was terrifying. It terrified me. I remember being very terrified by the way that they filmed that. So, honestly, really, if you've never read this book, you should. This is going to get an automatic 5 out of 5 for me because this is one of Stephen King's best novels, and I'm glad he decided to publish it. We almost didn't get it, but I'm glad that he did decide to publish it because I think it's one of his most universally loved books, and for a good reason. It's just so well done. So many good things in this book. You know, characters are great. Dialogue is awesome. The backstories are believable. And you can understand, you can believe, and that's part of the horror, why the horror works in this book. It's because you can believe this. You can believe that somebody who has just been through a traumatic incident like the death of your 2-year-old would react this way. Like if you had the ability, or if there was a place where you could bring someone that you loved so much that you thought, you know, that is no longer with us, that someone who died that you love so much, if you had the ability to bring them back, you would at least consider it. I mean, that thought would cross your mind. The grief and the depression of losing someone, you may not do it, but at least you're going to think about it. We can relate to it. We can relate to Lewis, and Lewis is relatable because if we were in his position, may in fact do the very same things that Lewis did. So I love this book. This book is great. This book gets a 5 out of 5. This is Stephen King at his finest. This is just Stephen King at his finest. It's one of his most tightly woven, horrific horror stories of all of the books that he's done. And this is the one that will stick with you. And I reread it, and I didn't have to reread it because I remember the story well enough. But I wanted to reread it again because it's so rich, so well described, so well written, so well plotted. It's just a phenomenal read, and it shouldn't take you very long. 374 pages isn't that bad. So guys, there's my review of Pet Semetary. Sorry if I got a little winded in the middle. Seem to have lost a train of thought, but it is late. It's somewhere after midnight, and my brain is a little frazzled. So my review of Stephen King's Pet Semetary, 5 out of 5 stars. Phenomenal read. Go out and buy it. If you don't own it, shame on you. You should have it. Get it in some format and read it because it is well worth your time to do so. And that's my review. So until next time, thanks for liking and commenting and subscribing and watching. Tell your friends and tell your enemies. And until next time, I will see you in the next video.